Hey folks, welcome to the next in the series of Verti webinars, looking at how you can improve your people and your performance. My name's Alex Young. I'm the founder of Verti, former trauma and orthopedic surgeon, and I've recently done a TEDx talk all about emotional intelligence, empathy, and what I call power skills, but what you might know as human skills, behavioral skills, or soft skills for learning and development in all businesses across the world. Now, I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting today's session, which is going to be really, really fun. We've got some great guests on as the panel today. And really, this webinar is all around remote teams and thinking about how you can adapt and deliver emotional intelligence and empathy training to your team when they're remote. So if you have a remote team, emotional intelligence is going to be key to making sure everyone is productive and happy. So you can learn from the best to create a strong remote culture and upskill your employees in empathy and communication skills. And joining us today as part of the panel, we've got Alan Hoskins and Greg Williams. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves to you. So Alan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Alan Hoskins, the name, and I'm the publisher of HR Future magazine, which I launched just on 21 years ago now, focusing on the future. And that was long before anyone else was focusing on the future. Today, everybody's an expert on the future. However, it's given me an opportunity. I come from a corporate education and training background. And the magazine has given me the opportunity to play in many spaces. And so one of the things that I also do is a lot of leadership development, which I absolutely love because I love the cut and thrust of engaging with people and seeing them grow. So in a nutshell, that's what I'm all about.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Alan. Greg, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, as mentioned, I'm Greg Williams. I am a learning design manager over here in Utah, the United States, at a technology company called Weave. My background in learning development is focused mainly in tech, is what it's been over the last 10 or so years. And I also hosted on the side a project called the Learning Experience Leader Podcast, and I have over 75 episodes where I've just really taken the opportunity to learn from lots of people across the world about how they design compelling and emotionally rich learning experiences that can help in all sorts of different contexts. And that's been really a highlight for me in talking to a lot of different people, and learning is a key part of what I enjoy to do. So I'm excited to be here to talk a little bit more about how we can help team members, individuals, and ourselves thrive even when we're working separated physically from one another.
Amazing. We've got a huge amount of collective brain power focusing around learning and development and emotional intelligence on our panel today. And if you are watching live or watching this recorded via LinkedIn or YouTube, do engage with the comments, do follow along. The panel and myself will answer any questions towards the end of today's webinar. And you can also get in touch with us via some of the links that we put in the description too. So without further ado, to really sort of kick things off and get into things, we're going to cover a couple of key topics. First and foremost, starting off with why organizations actually need emotional intelligence to function effectively. So Alan, let's come to you first. Why is emotional intelligence an absolute necessity for modern organizations?
Alex, one of the things that leaders need today is influence. Back in the day when we had command and control leadership, there was no need for influence. One told people what to do, and they simply had to go and do those things. So it was very much a compliance. Today, however, that's no longer the case. And we've seen the command and control model falling into disrepair. And I think that the pandemic over the last 2.5 years or so has really provided a tipping point where leaders have had to show empathy, they've had to show compassion in order to ensure that their people are able to perform as they should and as they would like them to. And so because of the need for influence, we have to have leaders who have got an emotional intelligence that enables them to, first of all, have a level of self-awareness for themselves, and then be able to be aware of how their people are feeling, behaving, conducting themselves, and why. And by marrying those two, we then have leaders who have influence and can be effective.
And Greg, when we talk about emotional intelligence or EQ or empathy, often a lot of the definitions of these words are sort of lost in translation a little bit, and they can mean different things to different folks. What for you as a learning development designer is emotional intelligence when you are training somebody or for any organization?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person, if I'm going to dig in and think about training or imparting knowledge or skills to other individuals, getting into the nitty gritty of the definition is really helpful for me to just get my head wrapped around what the playing field looks like. So Dr. Angela Duckworth over at the University of Pennsylvania, she explained in a recent conversation with Stephen Dubner of Freakonomics fame, she said that emotional intelligence is defined as an ability, not a tendency, but a capacity. And there's 4 components. I think of the acronym PUUM, so PUM, or PUM, however you want to say it. That helps me. I've been trying to remember that. But it's the ability to perceive emotions is the P, to be able to understand what those emotions mean and where they're coming from. Then also the capacity or ability to use those emotions in ways that are beneficial and helpful. And then finally, to manage those emotions. And that's both within yourself and with others. And so when I think about that first part, the ability to perceive emotions, whether it's in myself or members of my team, if I'm not sitting near them or I'm not having as much face time and I'm limited to maybe like 1 to 5 times a week or whatever that I'm having a virtual chat face to face through video, just the sheer amount of information or data that I can perceive about one's emotional state in a general conversation is a lot more limited than if I was working side by side with somebody. And so that speaks to a lot of what maybe we'll get in later about what are some ways that we can increase the opportunity to perceive more about emotions from others, but also then to name those emotions and label them so we can begin to understand them and use them in positive ways. We can't manage emotions, right, if we can't observe them or notice them, and especially if we can't name them. So that's really important in my mind to getting around this training of emotional intelligence or fostering a solid culture of emotional intelligence on your team is really cultivating a firm understanding of what that term means and how that plays out across individuals and organizations.
No, absolutely. And I think one thing that whenever emotional intelligence or empathy is spoken about in general, often we say it's important or it's needed, but often there aren't really the statistics or outcomes talked about in as much detail, certainly as I would like, as how these then translate into business outcomes to make these things absolutely vital for any sort of C-suite executive to think, I really need to spend money and invest in upskilling my people in their EQ, in their empathetic ability. Alan, just kind of coming back to you first before going to Greg again. What for you are some good examples of where emotional intelligence can lead to improved business outcomes for organizations?
One of the things that immediately comes to mind is the ability to sense what your customer needs and to convey that to them so that your customer feels that you really understand them and that you get them and that you feel their pain and that you've got a solution for their pain. And you think about it, Alex, you're a doctor, you know this very well. You know, when someone goes from doctor to doctor and it doesn't find any help, when they find the doctor that says, this is what I think it is and this is why, and they say, you have solved my problem, you have put it in a nutshell, you have named it, you understand my pain, you've got a junkie, you've got someone who's hooked. And that's why it's so important for C-suite executives to understand their clients and for their clients to know, their customers to know that they get them.
And Greg, for you, when you're perhaps looking for more budget or you're working with people, what are some examples that you give to folks who need a little bit of evidence to prove to them that emotional intelligence is just so important for organizations?
Yeah, so I actually don't have any experience explicitly saying, going for that, like, hey, we need this for emotional intelligence. But like we were talking about before, these terms like empathy, emotional intelligence, and a lot of these other things, folks get it, they understand it, but they might be using a totally different language. And so for my cases, as I've thought about what is it that my learners, or like as Alan was talking about, my customers really need and want, what are they willing to give in order to get certain things, and how can I make that happen? As I really understand deeply what they're going for through user research and essentially interviewing and connecting with those folks, is then taking a very similar approach to my stakeholders. And it's trying to understand what value are they trying to drive in the business, what does success look like for them, and what's the language they're using. And that might include metrics, it might include certain projects being completed, and understanding it from their world. It then helps me learn their language and to be able to put in context what I see the learner or the customer needing into the framework or the mental model that my stakeholders are coming at from the world perspective. So if I'm thinking of an emotional intelligence training, if I deemed that important and necessary because of all my research I've done on my learner base, I might not go and knock on the door of the head honcho executive and say, let's do this training, but instead it would then do the required early work with those stakeholder groups. I might do a stakeholder analysis. From the project management discipline, there's a few different grid frameworks you can use to understand who has a lot of influence in the organization and a lot of interest in what I'm doing, and bringing them in early and at a deep level. And then those maybe who have a high degree of influence but less interest, I try to keep them informed and build out a communications plan that way. So I don't know if that goes along the lines of what you're describing. There's a lot of different things you can do, but at the heart of it is really, one of those principles from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits is first seek to understand, right, before you're being understood. And that applies to customers, learners, and stakeholder groups.
I think that's a fantastic example, and just to kind of move things along a little bit. I'm hoping that the majority of people watching this webinar as a sort of self-selected audience are aware and know that things like emotional intelligence and empathy, which are these sort of abilities, can be trained. Hence why we all are all here talking about it. A lot of the sort of historic belief that your skills like emotional intelligence or your communication ability or your ability to form relationships were just sort of static and genetic were, hopefully disproven by Carol Dweck in her research and book into mindset. And we want to make sure that this webinar is as practical as possible. And if we look at things like LinkedIn's workplace learning survey or Udemy's equivalent as well, a lot of the emotional intelligence training or empathy training or behavioral training is really geared around sort of certain components of businesses, whether that is hiring, whether it's culture, whether it's sales, whether it's support and feedback. And I'd love to kind of just get both of your really sort of practical insights into how any organization can firstly go from this cycle of hiring people who have an aptitude and are coachable and have an ability to improve their own emotional intelligence through to building that into the culture, and then allowing that to infiltrate into areas like sales and customer support. So Alan, again, just because of coming back to you, when you've sort of seen hiring systems hire effective people who have elements of sort of innate emotional intelligence but also have an aptitude for developing EQ, what are some of the things that people listening can do now that's sort of quite practical, where they can optimize their hiring processes to really sort of get the best people in who are coachable and have good emotional intelligence?
I think that it's the hiring process is such an important part of who you have in your company, because once you've got the person in, if you've got the wrong person in, that's a difficult one, and it's an uncomfortable relationship from start to finish. However, if you're able to identify the right people and get them in, it's a win-win all around. So what I'm really saying is that during that hiring process, it's important for those doing the hiring to listen out for all the important things, to have that they should have emotional intelligence themselves, so that they have a level of self-awareness that they can relate to people who they're speaking to, who they're interviewing, and that they can get a sense of what their emotional intelligence is. And as you able to gauge whether this person will be the right fit for your company, so you are more successful at who you get into the company. And it's not only a case of just bringing the person in saying, well, they're good enough, that's it, and leaving them alone. That onboarding process is also an important part of the hiring process. So that the onboarding is not just a case of, well, here's your desk and there's HR and there's so-and-so and you're good to go. Some companies have a 6-month onboarding process where they take the new hire through a whole process that just enables them to fit and to gel with the company, with the company's culture, so that they become part of that inclusion. They feel part of it. And I think that's an important thing, that we mustn't just see it's as a case of, we hired you, you're on board, and off you go. But have that transitioning period where you get to a stage where you say, this person's okay now. They're going to perform as they should and as we would like them to.
Really interesting, and I think it just it just kind of occurred to me to sort of reflect back on my own sort of selection, I suppose, into healthcare and medicine, were certainly a big component of selection into being a doctor. So your medical school interview in the US or UK or anywhere, a large portion of the marks for that are attributed to empathy of some kind, and often how that is assessed for sort of 18+-year-olds is a case-based scenario sort of given, and then the interviewee, the applicant, is then asked to sort of reflect back, and their perceptions of a scenario are then kind of graded by the interviewers. And just to sort of really immerse people in that, the scenario that I got when I originally applied to medical school many years ago now was something pretty crazy, which was you've just accidentally run over your neighbor's cat. What are you going to do? And obviously the correct response, according to the medical school interviewers, was you should knock on your neighbor's door, explain things to them in an empathetic manner, and you were graded on how you basically broke this bad news, how you went about it, how you owned up to things, and how you ran that scenario. Now, that's obviously aimed at people sort of straight out of high school in the UK, or who are coming in from postgrad degrees in the United States or elsewhere. But just as an example, that's a case-based discussion. Do you think that's an effective way of actually identifying if someone's empathetic? And how do you think businesses in general should be looking for that in interviews?
Oof. Is that an effective way? Well, it's not my place to comment on the medical selection process. However, having said that, empathy is about feeling something that someone else is feeling because I've felt it already. And men generally are not known for their empathy. However, there is one case where just about all men will feel empathy for another man who experiences a painful experience when they, forgive me for being so frank, get hit between the legs. And all men will cringe, like, why? Because they felt that pain themselves, probably. And so it's about being able to feel experiences, emotions, and process that for ourselves, so that when someone else experiences it, we can put ourselves in their shoes. So let's go back to the dead cat. So I have to now look at myself and say, how would I feel if that was my cat? What would my response be if someone came to my door and knocked on my door and said, well, I just need to tell you something, but your cat, she's no longer there. And then reflect on that and work around that and say, well, in the light of how I would like to be spoken to, I need to share that with the other person. And as we start becoming better at it, and obviously that's a very basic explanation, but as we become better at it, we're able to reflect on deeper, more complex emotions and then relate to other people who are experiencing those things, going through anxiety. For example, someone who is anxious, if I am not an anxious person and I've had no need to feel empathetic, I kind of think, well, pull yourself together. And of course, we all know that's one of the worst things you could ever say to someone who's experiencing anxiety. So it's about saying to myself, how must they be feeling? And how would I feel about that? And then applying that in the situation.
And I think even just in sort of responding to that, question, that the thoughtful kind of way you went about it is, I think, what a lot of candidates fail to do. So I think often if you're using kind of scenario-based examples, people sort of suddenly are put on the back foot, certainly in an interview, and try and jump into thinking about the actions rather than talking through a scenario with the interviewers and sort of explaining their thoughts, their emotions, which, again, going back to Greg's definition, is exactly what you want to be describing and thinking about. Greg, just before we sort of come on and talk about how to really embed emotional intelligence into a company's culture, have you got any sort of thoughts or experiences around interviewing or hiring people and that side of how emotional intelligence can be leveraged for organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a few watch outs with this, because whether it's emotional intelligence or culture fit or these other things that we can talk about that we want to hire people for, we're really susceptible as hiring managers to our a host of biases. Whether we're confidence bias because we feel like we're going to bring in the best person, or there's the halo effect, right? Somebody's kind of like us, and they're similar to us. That's its own kind of bias. But the halo effect, right, is where maybe they really shine in one area, and because of that, you let that shine across all areas. So maybe somebody's really sharp with development skills, and you say, oh, because of this, they must be emotionally intelligent. But you might not consciously make those connections. So I think number one, when it comes to hiring, whether it's emotional intelligence or anything, it's actually putting on paper what really matters for this job, right? Writing that down and getting alignment across the team that this is the kind of person we're hiring for, and we're going to write it down. And then starting to break that down of what could we observe about somebody and what could we truly measure about someone along these different pieces of criteria. And if it is emotional intelligence, I love the discussion about case-based scenarios, right? It could be running somebody through a case where they're actually building something or working through something with another team member, or it's the situational based of thinking back and share a time with me when we get into the hypotheticals, I tend to get a little nervous about that, because when you start talking hypotheticals, people can say what they know they should say and what you want to hear. And then at that point, they're both just kind of lying to each other about, yeah, in this case, I would do this. And you're like, I would love for you to do that in that case. But it's all just abstract, right? So any kind of way in the hiring process, you can bring it into the realm of tactical concreteness and reality, the better, whether that's working through something together or reflecting on something that actually happened in the past.
I think it's a really great point that you picked up on straight away, which is when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's not just that external empathetic ability for putting ourselves into the shoes of others. It's also managing our own emotions too, and certainly in hiring processes and many other aspects of business work and your personal life. A lot of that is sort of actually understanding your own blind spots, your own potential biases, which certainly in the hiring process can really cause some quite negative systemic changes if your hiring managers or people involved in the hiring process aren't even aware of some of these sort of their own biases, like you described, the halo effect. And that kind of leads us quite nicely into the culture aspect of things. And Greg, just kind of sticking with you on that, when we talk about upskilling employees and emotional intelligence, we often bring in culture very, very early, and we say we need a culture of emotional intelligence. But again, in practical terms, what does that mean, and how do you actually go about, organizing that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that you could talk about, but two main things come to my mind. Number one is simply as a leader, and by leader, I don't necessarily mean manager. You can be an individual contributor and of course still lead out in how you engage with your work and with your peers. But as a leader, how you model emotional intelligence can really influence the culture that you cultivate across your network of people that you work with. So that modeling or leadership part would be the first. And the second is inviting a culture of mentorship and peer learning, community learning. So I want to just touch on one or two things on both of those aspects. So when modeling, Alan mentioned it a little bit. It's pretty difficult to hire people, to encourage people to be emotionally intelligent and hire them for that quality if you yourself don't really know what it is, or you're not actively learning on how to do it better, right? And so to build emotional intelligence across your team or the organization, I see that first and foremost as my responsibility to figure out what that means for me. And some ideas on what that means that then I can model is first to increase my emotional vocabulary, right? Brene Brown, a pretty well-known psychologist, has done a ton of research around emotions. I'm actually just finishing up her most recent book, Atlas of the Heart, where she documents 87 different emotions and or experiences and some barriers that get in the way. And the premise of that book is, most people in her research, out of thousands and thousands of people, can really only identify or name 3 emotions when asked, right? It's mad, sad, and happy. There's so much more to our emotional experience and to our humanity than those 3 things. And so to increase emotional intelligence on my team, it could start by me labeling and naming some of those emotions as I'm experiencing them and funneling those into how I run my team, right? So maybe instead of, I'm really mad that this happened with this project, we could break that down into maybe there's a degree of overwhelm, anxiety, frustration, and a bit of foreboding joy all mixed together, right? And it's learning that language and bringing it in, and that can spread to others as you start to use it a lot. I think the other piece on that is distinguishing between emotions and thoughts. There's a danger to do what I've learned, the term is called emotional reasoning, which is a cognitive distortion where because I feel this way, this is really what's happening. So because something you said made me sad, what you said was wrong, right? And it blurs my emotions with my thoughts. And so one way to increase the culture of emotional intelligence at my team could be when providing feedback or when communicating with my team members, it's helping distinguish the differences between, if we're talking about our customers and I, have a team member that say our customers are so fill in the blank, and they give them a label based on a thought and emotion they're having. It's taking a step back and saying, well, let's explore first the thought that's driving that emotion. And then, is that actually a true thought, right? Last piece then I'll mention is the apprenticeship and or mentoring, right? There's some recent research coming out from McKinsey and Company all about cognitive apprenticeship and the value that can come from learning from others and have them speak aloud as they're engaging with a problem. When we think of apprenticeship, we often think about, shoemakers or woodcutters or something, back in the olden times, right? When you have an apprentice. But in the knowledge worker age, right, where I'm working on things, a lot of my actions are actually hidden because they're stuck in my brain. And it's sometimes hard to learn from an expert because we don't see that thought process. So a lot of what we can do to foster a culture of emotional intelligence is to help our teams understand how we're thinking and feeling about a problem as it emerges. Obviously, we do that with tact. It's not completely transparent where we're sharing other people's personal information, but being able to sit with another person and debrief a meeting with a stakeholder, right? And say, yeah, when they said this, here's what I thought, and this is why I said that. And being able to have those mentor relationships and foster that kind of cognitive apprenticeship could be really valuable to spreading a culture of emotional intelligence, if that was the first and foremost, criteria that was being established in that relationship.
I think, absolutely essential points you've touched on there, one of which being that element of embedding a coaching culture into your organization so that you are creating these kind of safe spaces for people to receive critique on their abilities across all areas of an organization, whether it is something like a hiring process, running a meeting, or closing a sales call. Having things reviewed and fed back from a coach who themselves has a solid EQ and a good emotional intelligence rating is going to really be effective at scaling that through an organization. I mean, one piece that is always essential in any type of coaching, or as Greg, you mentioned, in kind of converting these skills like empathy and communication, which are a little bit subjectively assessed for the most part, is obviously feedback to make things objective, both in terms of how the learner is sort of introspectively self-critiquing their own abilities post kind of learning event and with a coach, but also the coaches getting feedback themselves from their sort of managers. And I just wondered, I wanted to get both of your opinions really, again starting with Alan. What are some of the ways that we can kind of integrate support and feedback into our organizations that really helps to drive emotional intelligence too?
I think that feedback, and I use the word criticism with feedback, it's important for us to become comfortable with feedback ourselves, first of all. And that speaks to our level of vulnerability. Because if Greg was talking about modeling behavior, and if I model the behavior where I display as a leader that I'm prepared to show my vulnerability and say, oh, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. I thought that was going to work out like that, and it didn't. And, my apologies. People they take my lead, and they say, well, okay, it's okay. If he says it's okay to reveal his own vulnerability, it's okay for me to reveal my own vulnerability. And so as I do that, and as I show that I'm prepared to also listen to feedback and not become defensive about it, that will also permeate the culture, and others will then become more comfortable with that as well. With regard to criticism, one of the things that one of the points I want to make is that I think that criticism, we're sensitive to criticism when we deep down feel that we actually can't do any better than that. That was our level best, and now someone's come and criticized that, and well, I just can't do any better. Now, if you think about the sports environment, where a sports person has a coach, and that sporting person, whether it be a tennis player, let's just say as an example, is being coached by their coach, and they play a shot in a certain way, and the coach says, well, I'd like you to do this with your feet, or this with your hand, or your wrist, or your arm, your elbow. They don't get hurt and defeated and defensive about it, because they secretly know that they can do better and that they can do it. So they'll try that and they'll work at it. And that's a technique that we have to start introducing into the workplace, that I make a comment to you because I think you can do it. And when people catch that and they get that, they become a lot less sensitive to criticism and to feedback.
I mean, really, really interesting points. I mean, one thing, again, I sort of reflect back on my own medical training, is that often, we were taught how to actually deliver what we could term sort of feedback and communication to patients, which could be good or bad. And in the work setting, now running several businesses, those skills of how to signpost things, how to deliver, in medicine, bad news about a diagnosis, but in a work setting, it might be a poor performance report to someone in a manner that is not confrontational, is supportive, and actually gets them to improve upon themselves, even if something isn't going quite as you would like, is itself, a real skill. And Greg, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around that, how we can look at sort of training for those quite specific instances of, say, delivering performance feedback, or trying to get the best out of people who might not be that receptive to feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two specific things that can help. So one, I'm going to back up a little bit, is often we're running on default, just because of the sheer amount of stuff going on and information coming at us, that our bodies need to run on default for a lot of tasks, so we can put forth most of our energy towards other things. Unfortunately, that means giving feedback turns into something that can happen only at the default times, which might be that once a year performance review, or when something really goes bad. And unfortunately, that's not the most helpful thing. Folks need feedback a lot more regularly than once a year, or when they really blow it. They need feedback on when things are going really well, so they can do more of it, and also when something was good but could be a little bit better. And so something that's been helpful for me is I set reminders for myself to ask the team for feedback about me, right? And so whether that's, I'll ask them in a one-on-one conversation, or I'll give them heads up. I've also sent out surveys, very basic surveys of what am I doing well, what should I continue to do, and what should I stop doing? And I might give them a specific thing, like about our team meetings or about our quarterly planning sessions, right? Give me feedback just on those three things about that. And asking for that regularly, I hope, normalizes it, and they can share more. And as they see me take what they're saying and act on it, they might be more comfortable and psychologically safe to do that type of thing, right? Especially, like Alan mentioned, if I point out where I've gone wrong on things, I normalize that. But the second point gets to your question. How can we actually provide feedback in a helpful way? And I have a framework that I follow. I learned from a local organization here in Utah. It's a startup called Campfire that is changing the way that organizations learn and grow for management and leadership skills. And this breaks it down into a few steps. So step number one is you actually ask the person, if I see something that happens and I need to provide feedback, do it quickly. Don't wait a month or even a week if you can help it. Ask them and say, hey, I have something I'd like to talk to you about. Can I share some feedback with you? Right? And the first few times might be scary to do that because people think you're about to fire them or whatever. Hopefully not. That's not the culture on your team, but to actually ask them so they can then develop a brief moment to prepare. Then it's to state what you saw, right? And there's a lot around in the book, Crucial Conversations around this. You're stating what happened as if it was filmed on a movie camera, right? So there's not an emotional element, and you're not using words that are loaded with, accusation or meaning. You're just stating what happened. Then you share the impact or your perception of the impact of what happened, right? So maybe in a meeting you said this, and later in the meeting I saw these three people make comments about it in result of what you said. Here's the impact of what this means, and it might decrease the trust, or in a positive case, increase the trust of the team based on what you said or whatever. And the next step is then to say, what do you think about it? Ask for their perspective. So you're sharing your perception of the impact. Say, well, what do you make of that? Did you pick up on that? What do you think? And finally, after you've talked through it, discuss what are the next steps. So this has happened. We've talked through it. What are we going to do about it? It's not coming through and saying, I saw this is what it means, and this is what you're going to do, right? But it is really talking through, this is what I saw. Here's what I see as the impact. What do you think? And then let's work through this and find next steps together. That form of feedback can be really helpful in the moment, or it can also take place across long spans of time. But it's best, I feel like, for practical things that warrant quick feedback.
I think one thing I sort of again reflect back on there is whenever we talk about anything practical, and certainly for people who might still consider emotional intelligence something that can't be trained, I think using things like frameworks is just such a good place to start for many people. Again, thinking back to my own training on something like breaking bad news, which in healthcare doesn't happen that frequently, but when it does happen, you've got to do so in a very sort of empathetic way, because for that person you're delivering the news to, it's a huge life-changing event. And we learned in a very similar manner using frameworks and kind of conversational structures. So for example, you would always start off by, even before the conversation began, making sure that you're in a safe space, making sure that the patient has a relative with them or someone supportive, or they feel comfortable. And then as you begin, you might sort of ask them to feedback on what they understand as to what's gone on so far in their treatment, or just make sure that you're up to speed with whether they are in their own situation. And then you might sort of start off by just building a little bit of rapport before giving something called a warning flag, which is saying something along the lines of, I'm afraid this isn't good news. And then sort of explaining things so that you're not diving in with, say, technical information immediately, which can obviously shock people, put them on the back foot and be quite confusing. But you're sort of preparing them. And then there are, lots of other components of that framework. And I think it's a really good example how healthcare, obviously through necessity and research and learning and development, has implemented that for a long period of time. And lots of organizations can benefit from looking at those frameworks, as Greg outlined, which is a really great way for companies to scale some of these things across employees, and try and really standardize what is quite a variable skill set for individuals. And just kind of on that note, I've mentioned sort of all the way through this webinar that there's a bit of a almost trade-off between people thinking we want to hire people who have good emotional intelligence or good empathy, or elements of that innate ability, but we also obviously want to be kind of upskilling those people and our existing people. In order to actually kind of train for emotional intelligence, again, in sort of real sort of practicalities, Alan, how would you sort of go about that if you're an organization sort of listening to this webinar? What can you sort of start to do to help your L&D team or your managers really scale out a culture of emotional intelligence across your organization?
Well, one of the things that I make a point of doing is training people, helping them to learn so that they change behavior. Because if someone learns something just to know it, but their behavior doesn't change, well, there's no point to that. Now, we kind of go through a schooling system and a university system that enables us to learn to acquire knowledge. And we don't necessarily do anything with that knowledge other than to demonstrate that we have it. In other words, we write an exam and we show that we know this knowledge. Now, if we're going to, I found that information doesn't change behavior. So someone will know, for example, and I've got nothing personal against it, but smoking is bad for one's health. Many smokers know that. They have that information and they're very intelligent people, but it doesn't change their behavior. So I exercise my mind around what could I do to help people acquire information in such a way that they will change their behavior. And what I started to play around with, which I found worked very well, is to help them acquire insight. Because I found that once they saw something that they hadn't seen before, or they saw something in a way that they hadn't seen it before, and which we speak of that aha moment when, oh, okay, got it. I found that caused behavioral change. And so I think this is an important thing to introduce into our emotional intelligence training, to help people to see things that they hadn't seen before. Because once you see something, you can't unsee it. And once if you never unsee it, it's going to change the way you do things, and the way you live, the way you conduct yourself. And that's the secret to me in terms of training people for emotional intelligence, to help them acquire insight.
I think Greg picked up on a good point earlier, and you kind of alluded to it there, Alan, which is a lot of these sort of training opportunities are traditionally learned sort of in a sort of very apprenticeship style model where people are sort of exposed to things in work. So it might be that you're a manager and you're having to fire somebody, or you're hiring somebody, or your company goes through a certain set of circumstances, such as the pandemic, where you've got to show vulnerability in your leadership and win that kind of company culture through what are quite sort of difficult changing circumstances. But if you're not exposed to those difficult scenarios and difficult work-life examples, you're not going to learn from them, and you're not going to be able to reflect, and you're not going to be able to grow. And often I will kind of see organizations looking to implement, say, a kind of one-size-fits-all EQ training system or something like that, where it's either video lectures or it's some kind of written material, in its kind of like worst form. Greg, coming to you on the sort of design side, appreciating you haven't necessarily constructed emotional intelligence scenarios specifically yourself, but just talking about some of the L&D principles here. If there's anyone watching or listening who is thinking about implementing some kind of emotional intelligence training for their organization, what do you think are some pitfalls they need to avoid, and what are some of the best tips you can give them to really kind of maximize learner gains?
Yeah, I saw one of the comments come in here in the chat about, should all of this stuff that we're talking about, which can be more nuanced and complex and certainly more difficult to implement, should this be prioritized as much as technical training? I mean, I don't have the numbers right in front of me. I was just reading this yesterday, so I can't recall it, but there's a lot of evidence and research around how important, soft skills related to things such as emotional intelligence actually are, and how much of an impact that truly can have on an organization. We tend to value technical skills during the hiring process, but ultimately when we look at the success of our teams and things over the long run, those things can be learned much more easily. Those things can be learned in scalable digital, mass online learning experiences. Like I could go into Coursera and learn the basics of Excel, right? Or I could go onto YouTube and learn a lot of basic technical skills of things, right? It's, in my opinion, taking that one-size-fits-all course for something like emotional intelligence, I don't think is wise. There's a lot of needs that are nuanced, and there's a lot of differentiation that would be required, and personalization. Maybe someday, when the robots are running the world and everything runs off algorithms, maybe we'll get there and we'll have individualized robots teaching us how to be emotionally intelligent. But until that day, I think a model like we talked about with mentorship or cognitive apprenticeship would be really a good way to go. I think it's also looking at the leadership team and working with the different groups in your organization to look at what is the culture of our team, what's the overall motivation and the purpose, how much are people feeling in control of their work, and identifying maybe pockets of areas in the organization or specific teams and or individuals that would benefit from increasing their emotional intelligence in a way that could be tied to larger objectives. I mean, we all can improve emotional intelligence, right? But it would be a much more targeted type of thing in my mind. And that way you can actually design something, to Alan's point, you could create really compelling moments. I think of Dan and Chip Heath's book, The Power of Moments, that can transform people. But then you can also implement key areas to maintain that behavior. We've all had a big moment in our lives that seem to change our minds on something for a long time. But if there's no reinforcement to that in our actual behavioral actions each day, then it's really hard to maintain that change. So the last point I want to make about that is sometimes it's not even training at all that we should be thinking about. Dr. Adam Grant, he's a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. When talking a little bit about that, he said, especially around this, the pandemic and talking about emotional intelligence and handling stress, he said, I've been deeply disturbed by the fact that so many organizations said, okay, you know what? We're obviously in a difficult situation right now. We're going to train you in emotional intelligence. We're going to teach you to manage all your stress. And he says that as opposed to saying, you know what, maybe this is the right time to finally fire some abusive bosses and start eliminating oppressive rules and stop micromanaging people, right? So it might not even be a training issue. So often things are viewed as a gap that needs to be filled by training when it might be actually a leadership or organizational gap that could be changed with incentives or behaviors at the leadership level. Being, middle manager at L&D, you might not feel empowered to go and make that case, but I think that context is really helpful and important to consider.
I think fantastic points, and I think again going back to the top of the conversation around sort of why sort of this type of behavioral change is so important as teams go remote. I think a lot of those behaviors which perhaps in a group environment where people are together in person, you can find some of those nuances in communication, and you might be able to be a little bit more empathetic with a boss who is giving you lots and lots of work. But when it's remote, suddenly you lose that extra element of in-person sort of behavioral and understanding, really. And I think the challenge for sort of everyone as they go remote is how can you deliver some of these empathetic or emotional intelligence training pieces or identify biases in your people when you're missing that big piece, which is obviously in-person body language or nuanced conversations, which are sort of lost over Zoom, over Skype, over webinars. And I suspect what's going to happen is as we go back to a more sort of hybrid working environment, people will now sort of see the importance still of getting people back in person. Just as we sort of start to wind down the webinar, Alan, I'd just love to sort of get some of your thoughts on that as we sort of are now in this very kind of hybrid environment where we obviously do remote training. Companies are sort of stuck with that for sort of cost savings and for scalability. But things are also now back up in force at doing sort of in-person training and having in-person meetings. Where do you think the balance is, and how can organizations listening continue to improve?
I think you make a good point there, Alex, in terms of the word balance. I'm running a leadership program with a particular company at the moment, and it's been largely, as a result of the pandemic, it's been largely virtual. So we started it in last August, and we were running virtually. And in February this year was the first time that we had a live session, and it was one of those moments where they all said, "We just cannot believe how important it is to just read the room." And some of them said they were so uncomfortable in the virtual space, but yeah, where they could see one another, they're a lot more prepared to share and be open about their views and so on and so forth. So I think that's the important thing, that we mustn't think it's all of one and none of the other. There is a place for both, and one can do certain things virtually, and it's got a lot of convenience, but you cannot replace that being in the room and reading the room and engaging with people. Just another thing that I also want to say too is that companies must be careful of treating emotional intelligence training as an event. It's not an event. It's not a case of, well, let's do an emotional training program today, and then everybody's emotional intelligence is fine. It's a journey, because people need to have an experience, go through a little short journey, whether it be a morning or a day, and reflect on that, because a lot of learning happens after the fact, after that event, where they reflect. They're standing in the shower, they're driving in their car, and they're thinking about things. And then when they come back together again, one can build on that. And so as we get their feedback and we say, well, how does it go? What are you learning? And we build on those things. We can then personalize it as well, because we can gauge where each person is. We can personalize it and we can make it a lot more effective. So balance to me is the thing with the hybrid, a bit of both.
And Greg, I'll sort of come to you for the final point, just before we sort of start to close things out, which is, again, thinking about the current sort of economic climate. We're seeing lots of companies lay people off and try and tighten up their purse strings. And obviously when they're running these kind of hybrid and certainly fully remote in some case organizations. There've been some terrible mistakes that have been reported, and I suspect even more that haven't, where people have either been laid off over Zoom or laid off in a very impersonal way. Going back to that kind of piece on culture and sort of reflection, how do you think that people can kind of get better at sort of almost like checking their own systems in terms of how they go about some of these really big company change points using some of the systems that we've touched on?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of those headlines, and it's painful to watch, and it's even more painful to see those organizations get bludgeoned and taken down so harshly in such a public way. Some may argue they deserve it, but I don't know, we're all learning in different ways, and some of our mistakes are bigger than others, and that's rough. I think in terms of what I can speak to with confidence as we think about decisions in a hybrid model, whether it's how we're working or how we're learning together, what Alan said about being able to read a room and being with other people and that sort of thing is true. There's so much truth to that. And it's also true that we can save a ton of money by not flying all over the place to have a meeting about things. And so how do we reconcile or hold both of those things in our minds at the same time? And like many things, I have some go-to heuristics and models. There was an article written in the Harvard Business Review back in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, actually, called the Transformer CLO, or Chief Learning Officer. And it actually breaks down some principles around formats for training, right? And they have some recommendations that formats like digital formats that can be scaled and taken online, and I think this could go for certain types of meetings. They're best suited for hard skills, mandatory training like compliance or simple topics. It's also for durable and reusable material, right? With large groups, geographically dispersed, where the stuff is not going to change a lot. Maybe it's not super transformative to your soft skills, but there's a lot of value, they say, that comes from the face-to-face or blended model when you're dealing with things like emotional intelligence, or you're pulling together a group for an ad hoc training. The topics are a little bit more complex, right? Or the material changes regularly. Those types of things require a higher degree of trust, a degree of communication that the nonverbal aspects of being in person can really help with. And I think every organization is going to be different and have different needs. It's the ability to reflect, to your original question. It's taking the time for me as an individual to actually block out distractions, take time to reflect on feedback I've been given that I've proactively, elicited from those around me, and make plans to change and to improve. I think all of us, just like eating our vegetables and exercising, we know we should do that, but it's really hard because the odds are not stacked in our favor. The world is screaming for our attention all the time with addicting substances of all sorts, from screens to food to everything in between. And so it's really being intentional about taking that time and finding out what is most essential for me, my development, and then for my team. And there was another question that I saw that came in that goes right to that. I think is it down to the team or the team's leaders to embrace this culture, or both? And it's both. But change really starts with you, right? You're the one that can start the change. You can be a positive deviant in your organization to really bring about an increase in emotional intelligence across your group. And that doesn't have to mean it's all virtual or it's all in person, but it can be nuanced and intentional based on the needs of your organization.
Well, amazing. A great sentiment to end on. Alan, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone for watching and listening and joining us too. We've got another webinar focusing on technology and soft skills coming up in 2 weeks' time on the 1st of July at the same time. So do join us again for that. Hopefully everyone's got some great tips and insights into how we can improve our own emotional intelligence, embed it in our cultures, and really make every work organization a delight to go to work at. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of the day and look forward to seeing you very, very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers.
Bye-bye.